This is a presentation of the Military Law Task Force of the National Lawyers Guild. This is Moral Injury in the Military Law Practitioner, a continuing legal education CLE seminar. Our presenters today are Chris McGee, an attorney and retired Air Force Master Sergeant, and Shiloh Morrison, a Marine Corps veteran and organizer with About Face Veterans Against the War. I am your moderator, James M. Branham, an attorney here in Oklahoma. This program is also co-sponsored by the San Francisco Bay Area of the National Lawyers Guild, as well as produced with support from Courage to Resist, the Center on Conscience and War, and the Oklahoma Objector Community. So we'll go ahead and get started. My name is James Branham. I'm one of the members of the steering committee of the Military Law Task Force, and we are very, very excited about today's program. I'll give a 30-second introduction for anyone new about the MLTF itself. We are an organization that's part of the National Lawyers Guild, and we have a long history of engaging in work on behalf of service members, but from our political perspective, which is anti-imperialist and anti-militarist. But we engage with equipping military attorneys that work in the area of military law, as well as GI rights counselors and others engaged in this work. For today's program, our presenters are Chris McGee, an attorney and retired Air Force Master Sergeant, and Shiloh Morrison, Marine Corps veteran and an organizer with About Face Veterans Against the War. So for today, most of what the presentation, I will be just kind of in the background to be a facilitator. If there's any questions, comments, please put them in the chat. You may want to mute your mic if you're not talking. We haven't had a chance to talk a lot with our presenters as far as if there'll be time for questions, comments at the end. Hopefully there will be. Also, at the end of this, a lot of times a presentation like this, a lot of people end up sharing a lot of things in chat with resources, things like that. So if there are things like that, I'll be glad to email folks about it later. And lastly, we did have information about how to pay the registration fee if you're an attorney wanting CLE credit. If you're not an attorney, you're just watching, you're welcome. We always welcome donations, but it's also not required. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started.
Thank you, James. And I just kind of want to begin with a sort of a disclaimer that at the end there is going to be a bit of a panel discussion with me and Shiloh, and we are going to share things that might kind of trigger each of our military experience. So there might be moments where we might need to take a pause. So I just wanted to kind of put that up front and make sure that there's space for that sort of time. So I'm going to share screen.
Oh, I need to set that up so you can do that. Give me just 1 second.
Looks like I have permission to do so. Does everybody see my
screen?
Oh,
great. Okay. Yes.
Okay. And as I go through, there's some pictures kind of attached to this. I worked in aircraft maintenance for my 20 years. These pictures are significant, and I'll kind of wrap it up at the end and explain why. So as I go through, I just ask that you kind of dwell on these pictures. So what is moral injury? This is something that has kind of come to the forefront of psychology in fairly recent times compared to PTSD. This presentation is going to be a bit of a mix of discussing PTSD and moral injury because they have similar effects, and moral injury is probably behind as far as our national and psychological understanding compared to PTSD. But essentially, moral injury is just that strong cognitive and emotional response that occurs following an event that violates a person's moral or ethical code, either seeing it or being forced to do something. Very often it's associated with extreme situations, life or death situations, but recent research suggests that it can occur even in lower stakes work environments. So PTSD is associated with a threat to our mortality, whereas moral injury is a threat to our morality. moral injury as social and emotional experiences that have a psychological effect. And studies suggest that the experiences of moral injury trigger on MRIs in the brain, the same place that physical pain is experienced. And I really want to give a quick history of PTSD because it really shows our evolution of understanding of PTSD to kind of frame where we might be at in our understanding of moral injury. Like, as we remember from World War I, World War II, we saw terms like shell shock, combat fatigue, old sergeant's disease. That was really just scratching the surface of PTSD and the effects. Later, the Korean War, Vietnam War, and only in 1980 did PTSD defined in the DSM-3. So essentially, our clinical understanding of PTSD is only about, what, 43 years old. And currently, moral injury is not in the DSM-3. So if we view it through the same timeline, we are prior to 1980 understanding for moral injury. We've learned that PTSD can be driven by acute and non-acute events. Essentially, an acute event is like a car accident or a hostage situation where there is a non-traumatic state followed by a very acute threat to someone's life, followed by going back to a non-traumatic state, essentially as a spike. There are also evidence that PTSD can be driven by non-acute events. We see it in adverse childhood events, food insecurity, housing insecurity, really that sense of a persistent lack of safety that can also trigger PTSD symptoms. In a similar vein, moral injury can be experienced from combat, where there is the killing or harming of others. It's not a stretch to understand that human beings believe killing or harming others is inherently bad. So it flows that moral injury would derive from combat experiences where there is killing or harming others as a course of business. Moral injury can also be from witnessing people acting immorally that essentially you are facilitating in some way, or failing to prevent immoral acts. There's recent evidence that there can be experienced moral injury in non-combat scenarios, industries such as healthcare, education, social work, and they also talk about public defenders might experience a high degree of moral injury just from the amount of people that they are representing in all varying levels of distress or trauma, as well as just setting people up for failure or using or manipulating people in your workplace to your benefit or to the organization's benefit. And it also stands to reason that moral injury would very likely co-occur with PTSD if you are engaged in kinetic activity that would potentially kill or harm people. It stands to reason that you also believe that your life was in danger. So very frequently, PTSD and moral injury are co-occurring. Even survivor's guilt and things to that effect would be a moral injury. The effects of moral injury, feelings of grief, anger, anxiety, guilt, shame, or disgust. The experience spiritual existential crisis, to include physical symptoms, unfair, undignified conditions, are 4 times more likely to act with self-interest and dishonesty. Essentially, if you are in a corrupt organization or workplace where dishonesty is not checked, you're more likely to drive towards a dishonest state to protect yourself in that organization, which is going to cause a moral injury. And essentially, moral injury is a redefinition of the individual to see themselves as either bad or evil in some way. So essentially, it changes their definition of themselves. So how moral injury can affect a military service member. As we discussed, the anxiety, depression, anger Substance abuse is certainly an effect of moral injury as someone attempts to mitigate or cope with that moral injury. Violence that derives from the anxiety and anger. And all of this essentially flows into, these three things combined is going to manifest as a service member below expectations of the military service, which can then lead to administrative actions to include unfavorable discharge status that can go on to affect VA benefits, education, health, or compensation or otherwise. This can also be confinements if it goes beyond administrative actions to Article 15 or courts martial as well. So I'm going to stop sharing. And the reason I asked everybody to kind of focus on those images that were in the slides is that is what those seemed relatively benign images, but each and every single one of those technicians was violating an Air Force regulation for safety. And even though they were doing their job in the performance of the mission, each one of them could have been served with administrative paperwork for violating those safety standards, even though that is necessary. So the idea of not adhering to standards for the benefit of the organization is so ingrained that even public affairs takes pictures of it, not understanding that it's actually an improper technique or use that the individual would actually be punished for. So that is in effect like a micro moral injury. So that is essentially the presentation. Shiloh and I are then going to do a bit of a panel discussion. And then there should be plenty of time for questions as well. So what I would invite Shiloh to do is if they want to talk about their experience in the military with moral injury or any sort of events, please feel free to. And again, if anybody needs to take a break or a pause, that will be very easily facilitated.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me, everyone. I think that just in general, and I was pleased to hear the when James just framed the political feelings and leanings of the group, because I would argue that anyone deployed, I was deployed to Iraq in 2006 and then Kuwait in 2007. And I would argue that anyone deployed at that, into that war, once they come to their conscious, will see that as a moral injury, since that was a illegal and unjust war. But to speak specifically about some incidences of moral injury, I think that being deployed, coming around to my own conscious that that what we were doing was wrong, what I was involved in was wrong. It's like a coming to your own conscious. So once you do that, it really has an impact on your heart and your soul. A couple of examples are I was deployed with the helicopter support unit, and then taken from that unit and placed into a trucking company. One of the lovely things about the Marine Corps is they don't really care what you're trained to do. They'll just put you in a spot where they need an extra body. And so they needed people to be gunners on a truck route. And I am trans at the time, though I was serving under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, not safe to be out as trans or queer at the time. And so I was very much perceived as a woman. And so they actually, I learned this after the fact, but the staff sergeant in charge of the truck company asked me to be his gunner because he thought that women have an extra chip on their shoulder and won't have a problem like doing harm and causing harm to other people. And yeah, so one of our jobs with the truck company was to transport so-called prisoners and combatants. And often, these folks, we had no background, no context for why they were captive. We were just there to transport them from one prison to the other. And as you can imagine, like anyone has that label of prisoner combatant is treated less than human, right? And you kind of have to do that in order to do your job. And so I would witness over and over just my friends in the Marines, these were guys that I knew for a long time and deployed with and trusted. They would just treat these so-called combatants just terribly, blindfold them, push them off of trucks. And as a at the time I was a lance corporal, which is like the bottom bottom of the bottom ranks, and I couldn't say anything. If I were to say something, it would have negative impacts on me. You can imagine like the shit that would roll downhill if I said anything about what was going on. So that was one incident, and then one example, and then another one was like I said, in the Marines, they'll just, doesn't matter what you were trained to do. I was actually trained to be in supply, but I never did supply work while deployed. And they put me on to sent me to Kuwait directly after my deployment in Iraq, and sent me to work in the mortuary there in Kuwait, where all the casualties were taken into the mortuary there. And so that was a very interesting, like, I was starting to become against the war and against the military in general, just seeing how inhumanely we treated other people. And then every day working in the mortuary, just seeing like the impacts and effects of war, times hundreds every day. And so, just seeing that over and over. But it's this continual, like, what am I going to do? I can't just stop working. I literally can't just walk away from this thing that I disagree wholeheartedly with. You just, have to put your head down and keep going. I don't know if you had other questions, Chris, but that was kind of just the general.
So thank you very much, Shiloh. Like, I think both of those kind of separate situations illuminated like different areas where those moral injuries can occur, right? So like you're seeing it from multiple angles, which I think gave you a better understanding that the entirety of this event isn't moral. There's not a moral angle to be found here in any way you look at it. My experience in aircraft maintenance was not, I mean, I was in Korea for a year, but I was not through luck or a lack of luck. I was not deployed, but even still, my career is not one that engages directly with the enemy. But what I found was the moral injury happened just from how I was treated in that career field and how I treated others as a result of it. And one story that really is the most maybe succinct is the word, is I was a supervisor, so I was in charge of maintenance for aircraft on night shift. And our resources of people, parts, time, experience had been low for so long. And I was working 16 to 17 hours a day, 5 days a week. for months and months on end with no end in sight. And the way night shift maintenance would work is when everything's done or you hit your 12 to 15 hour mark, you get to go home. So you're always kind of chasing a way to get everything fixed. You can go home.
And it's incredibly.
And it was a Friday, and I had come in and the turnover essentially was, hey, everything's good, everything's done. You just have a few things to wrap up and you guys will be able to have your first early night in 4 or 5 months. And everybody was like planning their texting their spouses, talking about, hey, I can maybe be home for dinner or all these things, or let's catch a movie. There was a lot of excitement kind of going around, and it was also like, hush, hush, don't talk about it for fear of this very fragile night sort of crumbling and collapsing. And as I was doing a lap driving around the parking ramp, a gentleman had come up to me that was a E5. He was a staff sergeant, and he was kind of on the outside of whatever this shift tribe was. Like, he was always a little bit different, didn't necessarily do maintenance as good, but he was a smart guy. It just wasn't his knack for doing maintenance, but he was very detail oriented. And he came up to me and had said, hey, Sergeant McGee, I need to talk to you. And whenever you're doing aircraft maintenance, nothing can ever be missing or floating around in the aircraft, because it can jam up your throttle and cause an aircraft mishap. So any sort of thing that is missing from the aircraft has to be found, or else you essentially rip the aircraft apart looking for it. And he came up to me and he said, hey, Sergeant McGee, I was doing my inspection and I found this big piece of hard Teflon missing in the engine bay. And I went from, I'm going to be home in 30 minutes and all my guys are going to be home in 30 minutes to, it's going to be a 12-hour night. We're going to remove an engine and all the work that goes along with it. And he was doing the hard thing. Like, it's very difficult to come up to somebody that has a very gruff outward appearance, and you're on the outside of the tribe. You already know that you're kind of on social shaky ice. And to do the ethical thing is to highlight that this piece of the aircraft is a safety of flight issue. And he had to come up and overcome all that and say and speak up. And he could have just never said anything, and we would have never known. We would have gone home early, but that would have been the wrong thing to do. And instead he kind of came up and said, hey, Sergeant McGee, this piece is missing. And without thinking, and as an immediate reaction, I just said, you know, I hate you, right? To which he said, I know. It was so shameful that I said, I hate you, to somebody that was working for me and was trying to do right. It was worse that he said, I know. Like, without me saying it, he had already known. And, you know, we worked 12 something hours that night, and he was the focus of everyone's anger that night for what he had done. And he had essentially done the right thing. And later I moved out of that position and I became another kind of supervisor for him. And I pulled him aside and I apologized for my behavior. And I've since apologized for my behavior multiple times, and then tried to find him a job that he would want, and maybe another area that would better suit his skills, less stress, to kind of atone for that harm. But in that environment, in that career, for many, many, many years, abuse was very often rewarded, and compassion was too costly to employ for leadership. And the harms derived from that, for my career field in particular, we see a whole lot of suicides that are happening. And, you know, that's something that I fostered in my time in service, because I learned how to abuse people from being abused as a junior enlisted person. So that's where the research that speaks to moral injuries happening, not necessarily in combat zones, like saying I hate someone and punishing them for doing the right thing, that goes against my moral code. like through and through. And it's something, I mean, this event happened in 2011. So 12 years later, I still think about it and I still like hold it. So that is most certainly a moral injury, if I've ever heard one. But it goes to, in the slideshow, it talks about redefining yourself as bad or evil. It took a while for me to be able to accept responsibility for my actions, but also recognize that I'm not a bad or evil person. So then the next inquiry is, what influenced me to behave this way in violation of my morals and my ethics? And that's part of what the exploration of moral injury is how did we get here? If I'm a good person, but I still did these things, how did we get to this point? And let's start addressing that and solving that. So I have probably a plethora of stories of a similar vein of me just being caustic, we'll say, much to the detriment of the people that work for me's mental health. But I would like to open it up to any questions for me and Shiloh, or just generally around the room.
Feel free to unmute yourself to ask questions.
Yeah, this is Allison, and I know in the civilian sector, what you're talking about would be called a corporate culture. And when a company gets a caustic corporate culture, you know, board of directors can take action to change that. But what could possibly happen in the whole military system to change that culture of abusing our own people?
Man, what a great question, right? So first, it's important to like frame the differences in the civilian sector versus the corporate sector, right? So first of all, there's worker protections in the civilian sector that are not afforded military members at all, even so far as a civilian working in the corporate sector, depending on how steep the abuse is, could essentially take FMLA for mental health, or even go so far if it, oh, sorry. I got the sirens going by. Even so far as maybe perhaps filing a suit for infliction of emotional distress in some way. That might be the extreme of the spectrum, but service members are barred from suits for torts against the federal government at all. So those are kind of foreclosed. And in order to address, I mean, in the DOD Inspector General program, there's supposed to be fraud, waste, and abuse is right in there. But the deference, and this is me speaking from my experience alone, the deference to commanders for command discretion and good order and discipline is very often whitewashes over the concept of abuse, especially when that abuse is normalized in that particular culture. Very often people that are in that environment don't even perceive what they're doing as abusive. So when you would go to do a claim for abuse through the Inspector General, they would maybe look at what do other units do, and they all do the abusive thing, and they go, well, this isn't abuse. So how do you affect change in the culture? You know, for me, it's looking at what is the underlying cause for a lot of these things. I'm going to pause, or I'm going to mute while the fire truck goes by.
For what it's worth, Chris, we're not hearing the sirens on our end. So
Oh, that's impressive, because they're right outside the window.
wow.
So, you know, for me, it's looking at where does this abuse come from? For me, it was a lack of personnel and a lack of experienced personnel. So we had to do things so quickly. And I always kind of said, I might have this great leadership toolkit with all these things that I can do to motivate people, but if I don't have the time to sit down with them and grow them, then I can just be a complete jerk and yell at them, and I'll still get my productive output. So essentially, the military has incentivized abuse as a shortcut to productivity, and productivity is the only metric that seems to matter in any of these arenas, be it maintenance metrics for aircraft maintenance or combat metrics, performance, and things of that nature. So I think the solution would be identifying where do we think this abuse is coming from culturally, like what would be driving it, and then it's going to be transparency, accountability, right? Because that's what, a lack of accountability is going to inevitably drive abuse, and the military is exceptionally poor at being transparent about what the military member is experiencing. The military members have restrictions on what they can say to the media without maybe running afoul of violations of good order and discipline, maybe contemptuous words versus a senior officer if they're an officer. So accountability has to come from those that have lived the experience, advocates such as ourselves, to lobby the ones that have oversight. And the oversight people are going to be Congress, essentially. But you require information on the experience in order to create the ammunition necessary to lobby to get the change that you need. So it's very difficult.
See a hand up from Siri.
Yeah, I'd like to ask both of you what you think the soft parts are where we could actually motivate the military to have some reason to change this. Because like you say, the shortcut is being abusive. The shortcut is hierarchy. And I think both of you have illustrated really well exactly what causes the moral injury and how it's this pervasive thing that no matter where you are in the military, and I think it starts with training, you are subject to moral injury. So where are our entry points to pressure? And just to add, especially because as a GI rights counselor, I have noticed that often I will think that a client is suffering from moral injury, but they might not be ready to understand that or know how to cope with it.
I can try to answer. I don't think I have an answer, because in thinking about these two questions are related. So I hear the question like, yeah, what would it take? But that would go against the very purpose of the military, right? Like the purpose of I'll just speak from the Marines. The branches are all a little different than one another, but the purpose of the Marines is violence, is harm, is violence. And so if you were to change that, you wouldn't have a Marine Corps, in my opinion. If you were to like soften that, I'll give you an example. When I was deployed in 2006, the public perspective of the war was starting to turn, right? Like the US public was starting to be against the wars. And so this big campaign around like kind of softening and being like, we need to touch the hearts and minds of the Iraqi people, and hearing that and like that kind of slogan or mantra, the Marine Corps took that, because they are an abusive, violent organization, literally was told like, okay, they want us to touch the hearts and minds. So now we're going to practice in our firing ranges 2 to the chest and 1 to the head. So we're going to practice 2 shots to the heart, 1 shot to the mind. And so like, that's just an example of like, the public opinion. Others are like, we want to soften this. We want to create a more, less abusive culture. And the Marine Corps is just going to take that and just do what the Marine Corps does, which is violence, and turn it on its head. So to get rid of the culture, to me, would be to get rid of the Marine Corps, the military. Another example is like you're saying, Siri, it starts with the training. I went through Marine Corps boot camp in 2005. And, you know, my drill instructors would repeatedly tell us, like, and this was in 2005, they were still allowed to like put hands on us and you know, shove us around and things like that. I don't think they're allowed to do that anymore. But my drill instructor would always tell us, you know, like, I can't legally like shoot you and shoot at you, so I'm going to do everything in my power to put you under that kind of pressure. I'm going to yell at you, I'm going to push you up against walls, I'm going to hit you with different things. So yeah, there's just, in my opinion, there's no real like softening of the Marine Corps.
I think that's a good point. I think, you know, the question is, can you have an organization whose mission is to kill people not be abusive? Or maybe the question is, can they be selectively abusive to those that we deem are worthy of the abuse? And I think it's, even though the whole idea of a slippery slope is like a cognitive fallacy, but like for a human being to turn off their abusive nature, just shifting from this person to this person, I think is actually quite difficult. So I think the answer is maybe not employing the military unless it's beyond absolutely necessary, right? And I think there's debate on what is necessary, and I think there's a fair argument that recent military engagements were not actually necessary, and I'm probably understating that. But to the question of how do we change this culture and curtail the abuse, you know, Shiloh and I had a good discussion yesterday, and I don't have anything to back this up because I think the moral injury research is at its infancy, and I think this will maybe come to fruition later. So this is more of just the Chris McGee thoughts and theories. But I think that the effects of moral injury happen whether the individual perceives there is a moral injury or not consciously. Like in my story at the time, in that moment, I did not perceive that as a moral injury. And later on, I reflected on it, and then I kind of came to terms with it, and I still process it and try to use that as a guidepost in my life to not be that way again. And I screw up and I have to like realign. But I think the anger and anxiety and frustration and resentment that I carried with me in that world was from all of those moral injuries, either that I levied on people or were levied against me. But only when I had the freedom to sit with it and analyze it was I able to forgive myself, right? Like admit these wrongs and forgive myself at the same time. And that went a long way in addressing it. And I think in the military, you are not afforded any of the freedom to admit mistakes. I think if I were to tell that story the next day to my supervisor, he would have said that is not abuse. That's what we do here in aircraft maintenance. So there is not I think there's a lack of emotional intelligence. And I think the lack of emotional intelligence is necessary to kill people. Like you have to deaden yourself in order to engage in conduct that ends people's lives or facilitates someone else ending people's lives. So it's almost this is opposite ends of the spectrum. How do you have an organization whose mission is to kill people have compassion and an emotional intelligence? Because if you try to do both, your people are going to be in absolute distress because you can't have compassion and kill people at the same time. So, I mean, I think I'm just reframing what Shiloh said, which is like, if you kill people, you're going to have an abusive environment. I think the best way to do it is to not engage unless absolutely necessary. Maybe that's a simplistic view, but maybe we could try it. I don't know.
One question I had was, and I'm basing this on the fact that probably the majority of the folks on the Zoom today are people that either practice military law as attorneys or who work as GI rights counselors or other kinds of advocates. I think for a lot of us, this is a really hard subject for a couple of reasons. One is that if you've done this kind of work any length of time, eventually you're going to have your own moral injury to deal with, particularly in the lawyer side. And I'm not going to talk about that in detail right now, but it's almost inevitable that there will be those kind of circumstances. That's one issue. The other issue, though, is that I find it difficult to talk to my clients about these issues because my life and theirs are so very different. It's hard sometimes to know how to begin the conversation and to have the conversation in a respectful way, because often as an attorney, my job is to hear my clients' stories and to help them to tell it to other people, maybe a commander, maybe some other official, maybe it's the Board of Corrections and Military Records. But we have to take in the stories and then retell them. And I was wondering if you or Shiloh have some advice on how to have these conversations, and also I'm curious if you've had these kind of conversations about moral injury or PTSD, but mostly moral injury, where it didn't go so well as cautionary tales. What are things we should avoid in talking with our clients about these issues?
So I think, I mean, I only have my own journey to like rely upon, but if somebody else had tried to help me reach these conclusions, which involved me admitting that I caused people harm and taking responsibility for that, right? I think I would have been very defensive. I think it has to be a journey for each individual service member or veteran, and maybe it's I don't think I would have been able to navigate it without therapy, like therapy running concurrent to it. Like that was where I was given the space to like talk through these things that I had a lot of shame and guilt over, and redefine myself as not a bad person. As an attorney, there's a certain attraction to pointing to the moral injury, because then you can go to the commander and say his or her or their behavior was because of these morally injurious events that happened under your command. You should give them leniency in whatever this is, get them treatment, and maybe if they work through this, they can come back to you and be a productive member, or maybe their discharge will be a higher because they're not necessarily responsible for these things. But I think it's, well, first of all, like, the VA literature on moral injury is very sparse, and it is almost exclusively combat focused, which means trying to make a case for a moral injury to a active duty or, to a current commander, I think is going to be very, very difficult.
Yeah.
And in essence, you will be attacking that commander and their command in doing it, which is going to make them defensive, whether consciously or subconsciously. Or it's going to go back to the whole, if you submit an IG complaint for abuse, they're going to look at what I've heard is, well, everyone else in the unit is subject to the same culture and they aren't behaving this way. Therefore, this person's an outlier and I can punish them. And also like the deference to commander, Article 15, you're essentially giving away and you're just pleading your case. I think the focus should essentially just be a sudden onset of the symptoms until moral injury is better understood in the military and better understood to the Veterans Affairs. I think speaking as somebody that I don't practice military law, just have all the military experience, I think the best course of action would be to just pointing to, they didn't have these symptoms until this date. We believe these things kind of led to these symptoms, but almost focus it as it's a mental health issue.
Yeah.
But I don't believe that, this is once again Chris McGee going on a limb, and I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychologist. Like, people that experience moral injury, they do experience anxiety, depression, anger, and all these self-worth issues. And very often those are mental health diagnoses that are medicated. But a moral injury is not a chemical imbalance in the brain. It's your brain reacting to something that you did that violated your moral code. And until you get to the core issue and address that, medication is just simply going to blunt and mitigate the effects. So going back to the question, and I think it's also very difficult because there are acute moral injuries, but also, like in my experience, was just low level persistent moral injuries all day, every day. How do you point to this is the event where Chris's behavior shifted from less violent, less anger prone, no substance abuse to now he is? Because I think it's a cumulative thing and it's a gradual thing, in which case it'll be very hard to point to it. So I think trying to use moral injury in an argument or as a justification, I think is just not going to work well, because the commander is going to be resistant to it. Might be very hard to point to a specific acute thing, and the service member may not even consciously understand that moral injury, in which case those arguments, you're not going to have support from your own client, the commander, or even the facts. So maybe it's the point is understanding as a advocate for veterans that they are experiencing moral injury and that is informing their behavior, but our job is just to address what we can without addressing the moral injury or helping to correct that. Just maybe it's a data point of understanding this might be what's driving it, but the more concrete things are the things that you have the space you have to work in.
And I can give some just personal experience with my own like personal healing from moral injury, where I think the most important thing is to feel heard and not judged. So because moral injury impacts the way that you view yourself and can change your self-narrative, it's really important for anyone when the person who has experienced moral injury decides, it's safe to share my stories. It's important for the person receiving that and listening to take it in and to not have judgment, because the judgment, right, the self-judgment is what changes our narratives of ourselves. So that would be the first thing, and to kind of let the person who has experienced moral injury like come to their own conclusions of like and then you can provide validation in the feelings that the person is having, but I would steer clear of like inferring or assumptions. Just let the service member do most of the talking. You can provide forgiveness. I don't know, for me, I'm kind of a stubborn person, so like someone else providing forgiveness doesn't do a whole lot for me, but it could, I think, open up some avenues for like self-forgiveness for other people. And then one of the biggest things for me for healing was just learning self-compassion. Like what Chris was saying, like compassion is kind of the antidote to causing harm, right? If you have compassion for yourself, then that allows you to have compassion for others. And once you have compassion for others, you don't want to harm them. And a lot of self-compassion, the way I've had it explained to me is like knowing what you know now, you wouldn't make the same decisions you made beforehand. Let's see. And then as we've been talking about, like kind of shifting your personal narrative is really important. And so just having that recognition that I am not these like horrible, horrific events. I participated in them for XYZ reasons, but I am not them. And so once you kind of come to that, you can start changing your personal narrative. And as we know, like personal narratives, the stories that we hold true for ourselves are really powerful. And so if you can, just continue to encourage the people that you're working with, that they're not the actions that they did. They are.
Mhm.
And then as far as like, I think you asked about like, what are some things not to do? I know like y'all aren't like therapists and practitioners in that way, but the VA was for a long time offering for PTSD. I don't think when I went through VA therapy, it was in 2008 to 2009 maybe. And the only thing that they were offering for PTSD was something called prolonged exposure therapy, which is horrific. And it's like having the person who experienced PTSD tell their story over and over, record their story, listen to it over and over, in the sense of like trying to numb you to the effects of it. And I can say from personal experience that was actually like did more harm than so. I think maybe a thing that can be used in that, knowing that, is like to not expect the person to retell their story over and over. I don't know if that's possible in your line of work, but yeah, I think once the person feels heard and not judged, like it has to be in combination, heard and not judged, and then they can really start to shift their own feelings about themselves.
Hopefully there'll be some more questions from others, but I'll go ahead and ask another one. I'm curious about the role of religion in moral injury. And my own experience with clients has been that sometimes religion is a helpful tool in healing from moral injury, and sometimes it is a hurtful thing. It seems like it makes it worse because it's an amplification of, sometimes religion can amplify the bad feelings rather than. And I was wondering if either of you have thoughts on that or how to engage with people. To me, the obvious thing is in the lawyer counselor role is that we don't want to attack someone's underlying beliefs they came in with, but there are times that their beliefs really are toxic and are hurting them, and I find it really hard to engage on that. I was wondering if either of you have thoughts on that question.
I mean, my initial thought is, of all the core beliefs, like religion is probably the strongest, because it is not only very often instilled at a young age, but the magnitude of the weight of religion is typically infinite, right? Depending on what the person believes. So I don't know if I would speak on it as the attorney. If anything, it would just inform me that maybe they would be willing or unwilling to move on a particular topic or on a particular belief, whether it's harmful or helpful. Yes, it certainly could be a source of the moral injury. You go back to the 10 Commandments, those are all like the most basic morals that any service member could violate. And that might be like a core tenet for them. Probably the most I would do would just encourage them to reach out to if that is in this, if they feel like they violated one of those tenets or one of those core beliefs from their spiritual place, to reach out to that organization or that sort of entity to work through that through them, because I don't think maybe the individual could, but other than that, the spiritual organization or entity would probably be the only one that could give them a process to work through a moral injury that might be coming from a spiritual belief.
We also had oh, go ahead, Shiloh, sorry.
I just don't know that I have too much to share. I imagine that would be really difficult. If yours, I guess this is a little tainted from being raised Catholic and not not agreeing with a lot of it.
Mhm.
That a lot of it is rooted in guilt and shame, which is also what a lot of, the result of moral injury is guilt and shame. So I would imagine it would kind of double down
Mhm.
if you were also a person rooted in a religion that has a lot of guilt and shame around it.
We had Alice Lynn said, I'd like to comment based on the book that I co-authored, Moral Injury in the Military and Behind Bars. So Alice, would you like to share?
Yes, first of all, I would like to thank very much those two of you who have been in the military and been through this path. My husband, Stoughton Lind, who recently died, and I focused quite a bit on some of these things that you have been talking about. We have a number of incidents of individual people describing their own experience in the military or in behind bars. We've worked with a number of people who are in prison, either with death sentences or life imprisonment for having killed somebody. And let me start with one of those. We were doing a class in which it was possible for people really to talk about things that were on their minds in a prison where it was mostly people serving very, very long sentences. And I remember one of the men saying that in his head, he knew that he had to forgive himself for having killed someone, but in my heart, I'm just not there. This sense of, yes, he knows that he has done this, and that he has to deal with it, but he doesn't know how. I think that suicide has been very, very high. There was a doctor who has written a couple of books on moral injury some years ago, and he discussed how suicide is just so much higher among people who have experienced moral injury. There also was a discussion between PTSD and moral injury. And Shiloh, what you said, asking you to retell it, that's what they do with PTSD, and it does not work for moral injury. Moral injury apparently is something which does not usually occur on the scene. It can, but it doesn't necessarily. It's when people go on R&R and they start thinking about what they did, and they go back into the society, and what they have experienced is something that's incomprehensible to the wife or the family or their friends. And they begin to think, what have I been doing? And then moral injury burns deeper over a period of time. One of the men whom we actually know personally was working in Vietnam. He was in the Air Force, and he was supposed to go and evaluate the effects of the American bombing. So he goes to this site where there are remains of people and animals and so forth. And he looks into the face of a Vietnamese woman holding a child in each arm. And he said, she doesn't look like a communist. She looks like a young mother holding her children in her arms. What are we doing? Well, then this is how moral injury burns its way through more deeply. He has retold his story in 3 different publications. In the first one, he said, he just went back to the air base. He didn't say anything to anybody about it. And, it was only later that he began to deal with it. In the second telling of it, he says on the way back, there was a Vietnamese, there was, I think, a South Vietnamese lieutenant with him. And he said that he thought of telling the lieutenant to stop at the nearby army base to see whether there would, or a facility where someone could go back and see if there were any living human beings there. But he didn't do it. On the third telling of it, he got into a discussion with this lieutenant and said, you know, shouldn't we stop at the air base and see if they can send somebody back? And they got into an argument about it. Now, those things can't possibly all have happened, but it burns its way more and more deeply. He's condemning himself more and more as the years go on. I made a couple of notes. Yes, it burns deeper over time. I think the volunteer army or the volunteer military has something to do with it too. I think people go in maybe idealistically, feeling that this is a good thing to go and defend your country, or it may be because they want the GI Bill so that they can get training or get training or use the GI Bill to get an education later. And when they get in there, this is not what I bargained for. You know, I made a terrible mistake to put myself into this situation. I didn't know what I was going to be doing. And there's a place, Quaker House near Fort Bragg in North Carolina, which does a great deal of military counseling. And it was from a newsletter that they put out some years ago that I read about 2 lines. And what you say about the Veterans Administration doing almost nothing, they have various ways of words that don't say moral injury. They try to get the person back into battle as soon as they can, or back into active service in some kind as soon as they can. Let's see. Well, I just would say that there are some people who have just done some amazing work and writing on this subject. There was a journalist by the name, his last name was Wood, who wrote absolutely the best book on moral injury that I have ever seen. But it's a different thing than PTSD. PTSD can be treated, but they haven't discovered any effective way of treating moral injury. Now, that's based on research that I did several years ago, but I haven't seen anything since that indicates much progression in that regard. There was one incident that we do describe in our book where when a military unit was going to go back home and the chaplain was having his last meeting with the men who were going to be leaving, he said, take a piece of paper and write out the worst thing that you ever experienced while you were in this situation. Okay, we're going to put them all into an urn or some such thing and set them on fire. What was he trying to do? To burn those things out of their experience as chaplain so that they wouldn't crack up. But apparently PTSD, yes, can be treated with medications, but moral injury is a different beast. I mean, if you feel that you have betrayed your own moral code and you sort of feel, well, what can I rely on? You know, what is there out there that can sustain me, that can. And then there are some examples. There's one particular in the book in our book, where the person has been through PTSD and moral injury, and they often come together.
Mm-hmm.
But he feels like what he has to do with the rest of his life is to compensate for it. So
Mm-hmm.
he's finding whatever way he can to be of public service. But it's very hard for these people who've been through it. I think also it happens in hospitals where a nurse or a doctor suppose that they have too many patients at the same time, so they pick this one and the other one dies. You know, I wasn't there when that person needed me, but the reason I do this job is to prevent these deaths. And, you know, it's my fault. I didn't call somebody else. I picked the wrong one. You know, I picked the one that would have survived anyway. I mean, the self-condemnation that comes from, as someone was saying, the work situation is in itself. I think, Chris, it was you who was speaking about that, where you're under time pressure, you're under work pressure.
Yep.
You know, it shakes up everything you plan to do that time. You know, you react in the moment and then you think, what have I done? So this is something that I have cared very deeply about and have run into time and again, particularly in prisons, because for the last 25 years, I've been working with people in solitary confinement or high security prisons. And boy, those prisons are infested with people who have done terrible things and are still trying to live with themselves and live with other people and not just react with anger or depression or despair or retaliation or whatever it might be. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Alice. I'll mention I put a link in the chat to Alice's book on this subject. I'm going to try to find it myself very soon. It sounds very good.
It's PM Press. PM
Press. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Before we go, I know Siri has her hand up, so I'll hand off to her in just a moment. Just want to take a moment to thank Chris and Shiloh so much for presenting today, and for all of you for the conversation we've had. It's been really good. Do keep an eye on your email. I'll be sending out an evaluation form after this. We really want to get your input as we plan future events. I'll go ahead and hand it off to Siri, and then we'll be closing.
Yeah, and I just wanted to thank you also. And I think this conversation has really shown the contradictions, because both of you have said in your own ways that you kind of have to, that it's a journey you have to go on alone, because really that's part of that little the knot of moral injury is your morality and sense of yourself has been damaged. But so it is actually a journey of healing, and it's one that maybe we can learn how collectively to support each other in this, recognize it as something that we are all vulnerable to, but it's a journey of healing. And we are up against the military, which has definitely not gotten to any point of being interested in the journey of healing. They are completely committed to the journey of force and violence. So we're in an interesting situation, my friends, and I am grateful to be on this journey with all of you. Thanks.
Chris, Shiloh, do you have any final thoughts for us?
Yeah, just gratitude for all that you all do. And yeah, and like I said, part of the healing is feeling heard and not judged. And I felt that today. So just really appreciative. Thank you.
Yeah, I echo everything Shiloh said. It's a good space and environment to explore this topic without judgment, because that's how we heal, but also we better serve clients. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And we so appreciate everyone who's tuned in today. If you have a chance, we'll have the video for this up later today. So if you have a chance, share it with someone you think might be, find it useful, and we do appreciate it. So take care, everyone. Bye now.